Hey everyone. So this past week we've been talking about westward expansion in the United States after the Civil War, and we've been having a conversation about how the building of the Transcontinental Railroad had vast economic and political and social consequences for the United States. We also talked about how it definitely highlighted some of the negative issues in the United States as it related to the issue of nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment, especially as it relates to the Chinese Exclusion Act. We're going to continue that conversation about westward expansion, and specifically we're going to talk about the impact that westward expansion has after the Civil War on Native American groups in the United States. Now, we've already talked about the impact of westward expansion on Native Americans, but the conversation we had was about the 1820s and 30s. During the presidencies of Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, the United States passed and then implemented Indian removal policies that moved Native Americans forcefully from their homes in the southeastern part of the United States westward. And this became known as the Trail of Tears because of the enormous hardships and suffering that Native Americans faced. As white settlers continue to move west into the Great Plains and beyond, there are enormous consequences on the Native American way of life. Specifically, the complete annihilation of the buffalo population in the years after the Civil War made the nomadic way of life of the Native Americans that relied on buffalo for shelter, for food, for clothing. It made it virtually impossible for that way of life to be maintained. Unsurprisingly, the pressure that the decimation of the buffalo population put on Native American groups led to resistance, increased resistance, to the incursion of white settlers onto their lands. This resistance ultimately led to violent conflicts and, in some cases, massacres and the brutal killing of Native American groups by American military units. In 1865, a year after an event known as the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, the United States Senate published a report that described the event as an act of pure barbarity. What happened was an American regiment under the command of Colonel John Chivington basically attacked a settlement of Native American warriors while they were completely peaceful, waving white flags and hoping to negotiate and communicate with American authorities and white authorities in the area. This was acknowledged then and now as an enormous travesty and an action which the United States government expressed regret for and apologized for even at the time. A little over a decade later, in Montana, a Civil War veteran, a general by the name of George Armstrong Custer, he led an American Army contingent into Montana where they found gold. And the finding of gold led Americans to want to defy treaties that had been signed with the Native Americans, and Native Americans left their reservations in response to this. And ultimately, military engagements ensued, and George Custer was killed along with an entire contingent of American troops in what became known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, which Custer vastly underestimated the abilities and the fighting abilities of the warriors that he was up against in Montana. In 1890, in Lakota Sioux territory, the American military outposts and commanders in the region became a little bit uncomfortable when the Lakota Sioux kept practicing what was known as the ghost dance. The ghost dance was a tribal dance in which the Lakota Sioux would pray basically for the return of the buffalo, for the leaving of white settlers, and for the resumption of the way of life that existed before white settlers encroached on their lands. When American troops went to a Lakota Sioux camp to try to disarm anyone there who was armed, it ended up becoming an enormous massacre in which 250 Lakota Sioux were killed, mostly women and children. These military engagements and massacres are only part of the story. The other part of the story has to do with the intent and desire on the part of American policymakers to try to eliminate Native American culture. They did this by trying to assimilate Native Americans into white American culture through the use of boarding schools. The most prominent of these boarding schools occurred in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Your first task this week is to watch a documentary film that talks about this boarding school. This film was called In the White Man's Image. It highlights how this boarding school tried to strip Native Americans of their cultural identity and turn them into people who were much more like white Americans. Your second task this week will require you to explore some documents related to the boarding school that you'll watch the video about. And it will provide you different and alternative viewpoints that maybe weren't presented in the video to give you a deeper and richer understanding of what some of the major problems were with this American policy. It's safe to say that the westward expansion of the United States had enormous impacts on many, many different groups of people. I think it's fair to say one of the people most impacted and negatively impacted were Native American populations that lived in the territories that white settlers were encroaching upon. Hopefully, through studying the history and understanding it, we can make sure that we value the heritage of the people who have lived in this country and live in the land that is now the United States, and also ensure that the rights of groups throughout the country are always protected and honored.